The rain had been falling over Manhattan since early morning, covering the city in a silver curtain that blurred the lights of skyscrapers and turned every street into a river of reflections. High above the restless city, on the top floor of a luxurious penthouse overlooking Central Park, Adrian Blackwood stood silently before a wall of glass. At 43 years old, Adrian was one of America's richest businessmen, a billionaire whose real estate empire stretched across the country. Newspapers admired his brilliant mind, investors trusted his every decision, and competitors feared his relentless determination. To the world, he was the perfect symbol of success. Yet behind the tailored suits, expensive watches, and private jets was a man who lived in complete emotional isolation. 6 years earlier, Adrian had lost his beloved wife, Emily, after a long battle with cancer. Her death had shattered the compassionate man he once was. Since then, he had buried every emotion beneath endless work. His mansion was filled with priceless art, rare antiques, and luxurious furniture, but it had never felt more empty. Employees walked carefully through its halls, speaking in whispers whenever Adrian was nearby. He was never cruel without reason, but his cold silence made everyone nervous. He believed emotions clouded judgment and that trusting people only led to disappointment. Among the dozens of employees working in the mansion was a young maid named Sarah Collins. At 26 years old, Sarah had become known for something rare in a house filled with fear: her kindness. She greeted every employee with a warm smile, helped others without expecting anything in return, and quietly completed every task assigned to her. She arrived before sunrise every morning and often stayed long after sunset. Despite the long hours and modest salary, she never complained. Whenever someone asked how she managed to remain cheerful, she simply smiled and replied, "Everyone is carrying a burden that nobody else can see." Those words stayed with anyone who heard them, though no one truly understood what she meant. One Thursday evening, dark clouds swallowed the skyline as another heavy storm rolled across the city. Adrian had just finished a tense meeting after losing a billion-dollar business deal. Frustrated, he loosened his tie and walked through the mansion, hoping the silence would calm his mind. As he passed a hallway overlooking the servants' courtyard, something unusual caught his attention. Outside, beneath the pouring rain, Sarah sat alone on an old wooden bench. She wasn't hiding beneath the nearby shelter or eating inside the warm staff dining room. Instead, she quietly opened a small plastic container holding plain white rice and a single boiled egg. Rain soaked her hair, her uniform, and even her food, yet she continued eating slowly without showing the slightest sign of discomfort. Adrian frowned. Why would anyone choose to sit in the rain when there was shelter only a few steps away? Then he noticed something even stranger. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, looked toward the dark sky, and smiled gently, though tears rolled down her cheeks. The rain washed them away before anyone else could notice. For reasons he couldn't explain, Adrian couldn't look away. Something about that lonely figure sitting peacefully beneath the storm stirred emotions he had buried years ago. Without thinking, he picked up a large black umbrella and walked outside. The sound of rain echoed across the courtyard as he approached her. Sarah looked up, startled. She immediately stood, holding her lunchbox close to her chest. "I'm sorry, sir," she said softly. "I didn't realize anyone was watching." Adrian studied her face. "You know there's a dining room inside," he said calmly. "Why are you eating out here?" Sarah forced a small smile. I just like the rain." Adrian shook his head. "No, that's not the real reason." For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Only the rain filled the silence. Finally, Sarah looked toward the gray sky once more. "Sometimes," she whispered, "the rain hides the tears people don't want anyone else to see." Those few words struck Adrian harder than any business failure ever had. Before he could ask another question, Sarah politely excused herself, picked up her empty container, and hurried back inside the mansion. Adrian remained standing alone beneath the storm, watching the rain fall. For the first time in years, the billionaire who believed he understood everything realized he knew absolutely nothing about the quiet woman who cleaned his home every day. And deep inside, a question began to grow. What kind of pain could make someone smile while crying in the rain? That night, Adrian Blackwood couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sarah sitting alone in the rain with nothing more than a small container of rice and a boiled egg. It wasn't the simple meal that troubled him. It was the peaceful smile she wore while tears streamed down her face. He had spent years surrounded by people who pretended to be happy for money, promotions, or approval. Sarah was different. Her smile seemed genuine, yet it carried a sadness deeper than anything he had ever witnessed. The next morning, Adrian arrived at his office earlier than usual. Instead of reviewing financial reports, he called his personal assistant. "I want the employment file of Sarah Collins," he said. His assistant looked surprised but returned a few minutes later with a thin folder. Adrian expected to find complaints, disciplinary notes, or at least information about her family. Instead, the file contained almost nothing. Sarah had worked at the mansion for nearly 3 years without missing a single day. Every performance review described her as honest, hardworking, and respectful. There were no emergency contacts, no listed relatives, and only a small apartment address in one of the poorest neighborhoods of the city. "Is this all?" Adrian asked. "Yes, sir," the assistant replied. "She never talks about her personal life." After the assistant left, Adrian stared at the file for several minutes. A woman who spent every day helping others seemed to have no one to rely on herself. Later that afternoon, Adrian walked quietly through the mansion. As he passed the employee dining area, he noticed Sarah leaving with her unopened lunchbox. Curious, he followed from a distance. Outside the security gate stood a little girl, no older than 6, waiting for her mother to finish work. The child looked hungry. Without hesitation, Sarah knelt beside her, smiled warmly, and placed the entire lunchbox into the girl's hands. "You need this more than I do," Sarah said gently. The little girl's face lit up with joy. "But what about you?" she asked. Sarah simply smiled. "I'll be fine." She drank a bottle of water, waved goodbye, and returned to work as though nothing had happened. Adrian stood hidden behind a stone pillar, unable to believe what he had seen. Sarah had willingly given away the only meal she had. That evening, Sarah stayed late to clean the mansion's private library. Adrian was seated nearby, reviewing contracts, when a small photograph slipped from Sarah's apron pocket and landed on the polished wooden floor. "Oh no," Sarah whispered, quickly bending to pick it up. Adrian reached it first. The photograph showed a smiling little boy around 7 years old sitting in a wheelchair inside a hospital room. Despite the medical equipment surrounding him, he held a colorful paper airplane in one hand and smiled with incredible hope. On the back of the picture were handwritten words. "Don't worry, Mom. One day I'll run beside you." Adrian slowly looked up. "Your son?" Sarah nodded, her voice barely audible. "Yes. His name is Ethan." "What happened to him?" Sarah hesitated before answering. "He was born with a rare spinal condition. The doctors say there's a surgery that could help him walk, but it costs more money than I'll ever earn." She gently took the photograph back, brushing away a tear before it could fall. "Every extra shift I work, every meal I skip, every dollar I save, it's all for Ethan." Adrian felt something inside him crack. For years he had signed contracts worth hundreds of millions without blinking. Yet this young mother was sacrificing her health for a chance to save her son. As Sarah returned to dusting the bookshelves, Adrian noticed how worn her shoes had become and how her hands were covered in tiny cuts from years of hard work. For the first time in a long time, the billionaire wasn't thinking about profits, investments, or business deals. He was thinking about a mother who silently carried the weight of the world. And although neither of them knew it yet, this heartbreaking discovery was only the beginning of a truth that would change Adrian Blackwood's life forever. Adrian remained in the library long after Sarah had finished her work and quietly left the room. The business reports on his desk were still open, but the numbers no longer held his attention. For the first time in years, he found himself thinking about someone else's struggles instead of his own ambitions. A mother skipping meals to save money for her sick child was something he couldn't understand. In Adrian's world, problems were solved with money. But Sarah didn't have that luxury. She fought every day with courage, patience, and hope. The following morning, Adrian cancelled 2 important meetings, something he had almost never done before. Instead, he instructed his driver to take him to the address listed in Sarah's employee file. The neighborhood was a sharp contrast to the glamorous parts of Manhattan. Cracked sidewalks, aging apartment buildings, and faded storefronts told stories of people working hard just to survive. Adrian parked a short distance away, not wanting to be noticed. A few minutes later, Sarah appeared, carrying 2 grocery bags and walking quickly through the drizzle. Instead of entering her apartment immediately, she stopped at the home of an elderly woman struggling to carry heavy bags upstairs. Without hesitation, Sarah offered to help. She carried the groceries, checked if the woman needed medicine, and only left after making sure she was comfortable. Adrian watched in silence. She had so little, yet she kept giving. Curious, he followed from a distance as Sarah finally entered a small apartment building. About an hour later, she came back out, this time dressed in simple clothes instead of her maid's uniform. She boarded a city bus heading toward the children's hospital. Adrian quietly followed in his car. Inside the hospital, he stayed out of sight as Sarah entered a brightly painted pediatric ward. The moment she walked into one of the rooms, a little boy's face lit up with excitement. "Mom!" Ethan shouted happily. Sarah rushed over and hugged him tightly. "I missed you so much," she whispered. "I knew you'd come." The room was small but filled with handmade drawings, colorful paper airplanes, and cheerful cards taped to the walls. Despite sitting in a wheelchair, Ethan smiled as though he had everything he needed. "I saved something for you," Sarah said, pulling a small toy airplane from her bag. Ethan's eyes sparkled. "Wow, it's amazing." "It's not as nice as the ones in the store," Sarah said apologetically. "It's perfect," Ethan replied, hugging the toy to his chest. Adrian stood outside the door, watching through the small glass window. He noticed Sarah pretending she had already eaten dinner when Ethan offered to share his hospital meal. "You eat, sweetheart," she said gently. "I'm not hungry." But Adrian knew the truth. She hadn't skipped dinner because she wasn't hungry. She had skipped it to save money. As Ethan laughed while flying the toy airplane through the air, Sarah secretly turned away and wiped tears from her eyes before smiling again. Seeing that quiet sacrifice stirred memories Adrian had buried for years. Memories of his late wife Emily, who had always believed that love was measured not by wealth, but by the sacrifices people made for those they cherished. Standing silently outside the hospital room, Adrian felt his heart soften in a way he never thought possible. Without realizing it, the billionaire had taken the first step on a journey that would transform not only Sarah and Ethan's lives, but his own forever. The image of Sarah and Ethan stayed with Adrian long after he left the children's hospital. As his car rolled through the glowing streets of Manhattan, he couldn't stop replaying the little boy's bright smile. Ethan had every reason to lose hope, yet he laughed as if life itself were a gift. Adrian, on the other hand, had every luxury imaginable but hadn't experienced genuine happiness in years. The next morning, Adrian arrived at his office carrying a question that refused to leave his mind. How much would Ethan's surgery cost? He quietly asked his assistant to find out without revealing his involvement. By afternoon, the answer arrived. The operation, rehabilitation, and medical care would cost nearly $300,000. Adrian stared at the number in disbelief. To him, it was less than the price of one luxury sports car. Yet for Sarah, it represented years, perhaps decades, of impossible sacrifice. Later that evening, Adrian returned to the mansion earlier than usual. As he walked through the hallway, he noticed Sarah polishing an antique piano that had belonged to his late wife, Emily. "You work too much," Adrian said. Sarah looked surprised. "I'm just doing my job, sir." "No," Adrian replied softly. "You're doing much more than that." She smiled politely but remained silent. For the first time since she had started working there, Adrian asked her to sit down. Sarah hesitated before taking a seat across from him. "I visited the hospital today," Adrian admitted. Her face immediately turned pale. I'm sorry, sir. I never wanted my personal problems to affect my work." "They haven't." She lowered her eyes. "I followed you because I wanted answers." Sarah remained quiet for a moment before speaking. "Ethan is all I have left. His father passed away when Ethan was only 2 years old. Since then, every decision I've made has been for my son." Adrian listened without interrupting. "I clean houses during the day, work here in the evenings, and spend my nights sewing clothes for extra money." She gave a faint smile. "I sleep about 4 hours a day, but it's enough if it means Ethan has a chance." Adrian felt a lump form in his throat. He had spent millions buying paintings, watches, and vacation homes he barely visited, while this mother sacrificed sleep, food, and comfort just to keep hope alive. Before leaving the room, Sarah quietly added, "I don't need sympathy, Mr. Blackwood. I only need more time." Those words echoed through Adrian's heart. For the first time in years, the billionaire realized that some people weren't asking for miracles. They were simply asking for a chance. And at that very moment, Adrian made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. That night, Adrian sat alone in his study, staring at a photograph of his late wife, Emily. She had always believed that wealth was a blessing only if it could change someone else's life. He remembered her saying, "The true value of money isn't what it buys for us, it's what it can save for someone else." At the time, he had smiled and agreed. But after losing her, he had buried those words beneath years of loneliness and endless work. Now, Sarah and Ethan had brought those memories back. The following morning, Adrian called the director of Ethan's hospital and arranged a private meeting. He made one request before anything else. "I want to help this family," he said, "but they must never feel like they're receiving charity." The director nodded with understanding. After reviewing Ethan's medical records, the doctors confirmed that the surgery could give him a real chance to walk. The operation was risky, but the specialists believed it offered hope. Adrian signed every document without hesitation. "I'll cover every expense," he said. "The surgery, rehabilitation, medication, everything." A week later, Sarah was called to the hospital unexpectedly. Worried, she rushed to Ethan's room, fearing the worst. Instead, she found the lead surgeon waiting with a warm smile. "We have wonderful news," he said. "A generous donor has agreed to pay for Ethan's entire treatment." Sarah froze. "What? What do you mean?" "The surgery is fully funded." Tears filled her eyes almost instantly. "There must be some mistake. I don't know anyone who could." "There is no mistake," the doctor replied gently. "The donor wishes to remain anonymous." Sarah covered her mouth as tears streamed down her face. For months, she had prayed for a miracle, never believing it would actually come. That evening, she returned to the mansion with a heart full of gratitude. Adrian noticed the joy in her eyes immediately. "You look happier today," he said. Sarah smiled through tears. "I don't know who did it, sir, but someone has saved my son's life." Adrian simply nodded. "Sometimes," he replied softly, "miracles come through ordinary people." Sarah thanked him and returned to work, completely unaware that the man standing before her was the answer to every prayer she had whispered in the rain. As Adrian watched her walk away, he realized something remarkable. For the first time since Emily's death, he felt something he thought he had lost forever: peace. Yet neither of them knew that the greatest challenge still lay ahead. Ethan's surgery was only days away, and one unexpected phone call was about to change everything once again. Sarah stared at Adrian with tears filling her eyes. Before he could say a word, the hospital director walked toward them with a warm smile. "Mrs. Collins," he said gently, "I believe you deserve to know the truth. The anonymous donor who paid for Ethan's surgery, rehabilitation, and every medical expense is Mr. Adrian Blackwood." Sarah slowly turned to Adrian, completely speechless. Her hands trembled as she struggled to process what she had just heard. You did all this," she whispered. Adrian lowered his eyes and gave a quiet nod. "I never wanted you to feel indebted to me," he said softly. "I only wanted Ethan to have the chance every child deserves." Unable to hold back her emotions, Sarah burst into tears. She stepped forward and hugged Adrian tightly. "Thank you," she cried. "You didn't just save my son. You gave us our future." For a moment, Adrian stood frozen. It had been years since anyone had embraced him with such genuine gratitude. Slowly, he returned the hug, feeling a warmth in his heart that he thought had disappeared forever. Months passed. Ethan worked tirelessly through physical therapy. Every small movement became a victory. First, he learned to stand. Then he took one shaky step. Soon, with the help of a walker, he crossed the rehabilitation room while doctors and nurses applauded. One sunny afternoon, Sarah stood waiting in the hospital garden. "Mom," Ethan called. He carefully let go of his walker. One step, then another. Finally, he ran, slowly but proudly, straight into Sarah's arms. She knelt down, crying tears of pure joy as she held him close. "You did it," she whispered. "You really did it." Watching from a nearby bench, Adrian smiled with tears in his own eyes. Ethan looked toward him and ran over. "Mr. Blackwood," he said happily, "thank you for believing in me." Adrian knelt and hugged the boy. "No, Ethan," he replied. "You taught me how to believe again." A few months later, Adrian announced the creation of the Emily Blackwood Children's Hope Foundation, a charity dedicated to helping families who couldn't afford life-saving medical treatments. He invited Sarah to become the foundation's director because he believed no one understood compassion better than she did. Together, they transformed countless lives, proving that true wealth is measured not by the money we keep, but by the lives we change. As for Adrian, the lonely billionaire who once believed kindness was a weakness, he finally found peace. Not in his fortune, but in giving others hope. And every time it rained, he no longer saw sadness. He remembered the quiet maid who had once eaten a simple meal in the rain, and whose courage had taught him the greatest lesson of his life. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest miracles. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories that remind us all of the power of hope, compassion, and humanity.